Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're speaking to you from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in the nation's capital, from which point the National Broadcasting Company brings you a song recital by the gifted Marian Anderson, considered by music critics throughout the world as possessing a most outstanding contralto voice.
She was a black opera singer, American, and she was denied entry into the Daughters of the American Revolution's Constitution Hall. So Eleanor Roosevelt went to the Secretary of Interior, Ickes, and said, "This is an abomination. I'm quitting the Daughters of the American Revolution, and we're going to find a place for her to sing." And so he gave her the Lincoln Memorial, which up until that time was really thought of as a monument to Lincoln and the preservation of the Union. All of a sudden it became, in 1939, a civil rights monument as well.
In this great auditorium under the sky, all of us are free. When God gave us this wonderful outdoors, and the sun, the moon, and the stars, He made no distinction of race or creed or color.
On April 9th, 1939, an unprecedented crowd gathered in what was the premier public space of the United States of America. A historic crowd, an integrated crowd, a hopeful crowd, together in this place to witness a concert. Marian Anderson stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a black woman denied a stage before a monument to the great emancipator. But the meaning of that day emerged in the 75,000 people gathered across the open expanse of the National Mall before them, the public. Anthropologist Setha Low has spent much of her career studying public space. She argues that what makes a space truly public is not the space itself.
Think of public spaces constantly being made, not that it is public. It only becomes public when people, in a sense, publicize it and make it public.
75,000 people gathered together in the civic heart of a nation built around one audacious idea: we the people. That April afternoon was more than a concert. It was a public asking a question. Do we mean it? This is the Sidewalk Ballet.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility.
Before there was a national mall, before there was a capital, even before there was a city, there was an idea.
There's an answer which you can put to that, which is versed in the classics, that goes back to Greece and the founding of our democracy and decision-making happening in a public space. And there's something of the ideal of that, which I, maybe naively, really hold on to.
The relationship between public space and self-government is ancient. The Greeks had the agora, a place where citizens gathered to debate, deliberate, and make decisions together. The founders of the United States inherited that tradition, but they faced different challenges. Athens was a city. America was becoming a nation. Not one people, but many. Colonists and immigrants, farmers and merchants, northerners and southerners, different faiths, different interests, different visions of the future. From the beginning, the meaning of we was both narrow and unsettled, and it would remain the defining question of the American experiment. The challenge was no longer simply how people would govern themselves. The challenge was how a people would become a people, how we could be both singular and plural. Could Americans see themselves not merely as individuals, colonies, states, or communities, but as part of something larger? And where would that happen? Where would the nation encounter itself? The answer would be a capital city, and at its heart, an extraordinary amount of public space.
Yeah, in a sense, I think people can feel the meaning of Washington, and in particular the mall, because it's so brilliantly designed. I'm Judy Scott Feldman. I'm an art historian. My PhD is in medieval art history, but I'm also a native Washingtonian. I was born in Washington, D.C. I think it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world, of the cities I've visited. And the National Mall was where I went as a child. In 1790, Congress gave George Washington, the president, the opportunity to choose the location of the new capital. And he chose Washington at the confluence of two rivers, which at the time had some agricultural estates and some homes, but it was not a city. And he asked a Frenchman who had fought with him in the Revolution, and who was trained as an engineer and builder, to design a wholly new city. Now, Peter Charles L'Enfant, and we call him Pierre, but his name as he signed it once he became an American was Peter Charles L'Enfant. He had grown up at Versailles and in Paris, and he knew European Enlightenment planning and ideas and classical design and so on. And he brought that knowledge to his planning for the city. And he and George Washington got on horseback, and they rode over the landscape, and they got a sense of the rolling hills and the river and so on. And he found a spot, a pedestal awaiting a monument. Now, in Europe, what would that be? That would be a castle, it would be a cathedral, it would be something with the kings or with the... He put the Capitol building, the U.S. seat of representational government. So he took his European ideas, but he now translated them into Americanese. And the concept was the newly ratified Constitution. The Capitol building, the single most important seat of government, a mile away on another rise, a monument to the president, the White House. But this great open space between the Capitol, the Washington Monument, and the White House and the Washington Monument was the place of public resort. He put we the people at the center of American government. And that is the concept which has prevailed.
Why do we associate public space with democracy? And certainly we do from political actions and movements. I mean, that would be your standard answer. But what if I take you back kind of to my model of public space? Because I was really curious. I'm Setha Low. I'm an anthropologist by training. I am a distinguished professor of anthropology, geography, women's studies, and environmental psychology at the Graduate Center. And I think for our purposes today, I direct the Public Space Research Group. I've been spending the last, 35 years studying public spaces and have written and researched public space and why it matters. Most recently, and I assume the way I happen to be here today, is I wrote a book called Why Public Space Matters, in which I put together kind of everything I'd been working on for a long time and, really came to the conclusion that public space really is the most powerful planning tool, if you want to think about planning the city, or revitalization tool, or sustainability tool, or democratizing tool that we have. In other words, it's really a multifunctional space that gives both meaning and sense of belonging, but to everyone, and yet at the same time provides for all kinds of activities and people coming together and the creation of what we call the public sphere, which is the sort of politics of what happens when we come together in a democratic forum. Why? Again, why it has this kind of positive democratizing sense. What I came to is one thing that we all know is that it allows for contact between people. And there is something, psychological contact theory, that has been around for 60 years. There has been tons and tons and tons of research that public space and the contact that occurs there, which may mean just seeing other people, has a liberalizing effect. It broadens a sense of worldview, it increases tolerance, and it reduces prejudice in a sense. We are social animals. Seeing each other does something, and it tends to be positive and an opening. And that's been well demonstrated. But I've also found that I don't think contact by itself is enough to explain the democratizing and other positive aspects. And what begins to happen is something called a public culture develops. The learning how to be together with difference. It's the learning how to be together in a space, and that there are all kinds of unwritten rules and regulations that begin to develop among a group of people that characterize that space. Contact in and of itself, I would say, isn't enough to make a democratic space, but that culture that develops, that way of being together, of accommodating difference, of people being able to do different things and be together, is important. And then there's a third element, which is the one I referred to before, this affective atmosphere, that depending on the atmosphere of the space, which can be designed in, can be having to do with events, can be geographic, can be many, many things. That those three things together create a public space that then has the power to bring people together and different things will begin to happen. But without it, those spaces might not really be producing the kinds of democracy you are talking about. And we need to remember when we talk about democratic practices of people coming together, conflict just as much as cooperation, collaboration just as much as arguing about what's going to happen there. It's part of the democratic process. So bringing together people with difference and they're working out the rules of being together.
I see in the UK, or not just in the UK, that public space as a means not just to protest, but just to gather, to meet your like-minded people, and to think of sidewalk ballet in a kind of like that serendipity, those moments of meeting your other like-minded people.
Dr. Cara Courage is a placemaking practitioner, researcher, and author based in the UK and works internationally with people and organizations who want to make culture, heritage, and place matter more and matter to more people.
I see those opportunities and those rights to gather in that way being eroded in all sorts of ways. And it's very scary in terms of a right to protest. But losing the right to gather in certain ways is one of those rights that actually we won't perhaps even notice that it's going, and we'll turn around and suddenly it's gone. And that really worries me. And that's one of the reasons why I do like to do the work I do in public space, outside of gallery spaces, outside of institutional walls, as a reminder, like, we have a right to be here. But I think there's something which I've been reflecting on actually with colleagues of mine in the US around third spaces and the real importance of those. And we have a lot of third spaces in the UK. And I think they're really democratic places. They're places like the pub or the park or the bus stop or the library, where you will be rubbing shoulders with anybody and everybody that you live around. And they're this beautiful place of contact that really help you understand the context of where you are and what other people are thinking and saying and doing. And that understanding, that sort of civic space like that, is so fundamental to our democracy. As informal as it is, it's so important. So when you say about place and its role in public space and its role with democracy, of course I think about the right to protest being absolutely stripped away from us. And I think about this suspicion of groups of young people gathering in a place and being told to disperse. But I also think about, in a UK context, the number of our pubs and libraries that are closing, that were these places where you had those beautiful serendipitous moments that could be really life-changing, but certainly part of your democratic, civic, citizen education as well.
For me, I don't think just physical public, but the way in which ideas travel, that is also publicity, right? The way in which ideas, the public sphere, how they travel. Public space is like a megaphone, and those symbolic central public spaces are like huge megaphones for whatever it is that you want to be talking about will, in fact, get it to the nation, get it to the rest of the city. So again, public space becomes important in this publicity kind of sense.
The importance of public spaces, which I think are underutilized, who uses them. We're all in our houses and increasingly on technology. I mean, think about the pandemic. And one of the things that struck me, and that I think a lot of us were fascinated with, was how many people, when really left to isolate, right, turned to public spaces. The streets were closed. They were made into places where people liked I think there's a desire for that. There's a desire for people to come. I think increasingly we don't know how to, right?
Sheila Foster is a professor at Columbia University's Climate School and an affiliated faculty member at Columbia Law School. She's well known for her articles and books on environmental and climate justice, land use, local government, and urban policy, including her award-winning Co-Cities, Innovative Transitions Towards Just and Self-Sustaining Communities.
I think the way we become a we together is to find out the things that communities and different kinds of folks have in common. And where do we find that? I think increasingly it's not online. Increasingly it's out there somewhere. And I don't think we quite know where the out there is. But I think people increasingly have a hunger for that. That's my sense. People have a hunger for more public, more of the we, and finding those spaces where we can identify. And I think we're going to see that increasingly as one of the, I think, silver linings that comes out of the moment we're in right now. So I'm hopeful that we can find that again, or find it anew, or construct it. We need another reconstruction era. I think socially, economically, and probably legally and constitutionally, like we had at the end of the 19th century, or the end of the early 19th century, I should say.
The first century of the American experiment would test whether the Republic could survive. Political divisions emerged almost immediately. The British burned Washington. The nation expanded westward. New states joined the Union. The population grew. The boundaries of the nation expanded, but the meaning of we did not always expand with them. Beneath all of it sat a contradiction. A nation founded on the proposition that all are created equal had also built itself upon the institution of slavery and the displacement of indigenous peoples. The whole time, Americans argued over what we the people actually meant. Eventually, that argument became a war. The Civil War would become the greatest test of the American experiment, not simply whether the Union could survive, but whether the nation would finally confront the contradiction at its center. The Union did survive. Slavery, as a legal institution, did not. But questions remained unanswered. Who belongs? Who counts? Who is included in we the people? The Constitution offered a framework for answering those questions. It established a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But it did not settle forever who those people were or how the promise of self-government should be realized. That work would fall to each generation that followed. The debate continued in courtrooms and legislatures, but also in public life itself, in churches, in town squares, in newspapers and meeting halls, in streets and parks, in cafes and pubs. Wherever Americans gathered, they continued to negotiate the meaning of the Republic and the boundaries of belonging. The American experiment was still being worked out, and as the nation entered a new century, so too was the physical expression of that experiment. The capital city itself had reflected the turbulence of the nation's first century. L'Enfant's grand vision had never fully materialized. Railroads crossed the mall, markets and temporary buildings occupied spaces intended for civic life. The capital city had grown, but not always according to the ideals that had inspired its design. If the Republic had survived its first great test, what should its civic center look like in the century to come? In 1901, a group led by Senator James McMillan set out to answer that question.
L'Enfant, in a letter to George Washington, he wrote in 1789 that he was going to plan for a city that could continue to grow and evolve as long as the country did. He was thinking hundreds of years in advance. And the fact of the matter was, Congress didn't even come to Washington except for weeks at a time. And so the city of Washington was not growing very quickly at all, and people were not coming to Washington. They couldn't get to Washington to try to fill the mall with public activity. So the first century had this grand vision, but there weren't people. There weren't members of Congress that were there for any length of time. And so the vision was always there. And when the 1901-2 Macmillan Commission or Senate Park Commission was put together with Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., Charles McKim and Augustus St. Gaudens, when these four designers were given the authority and the opportunity to redesign the mall, they didn't redesign it per se. They looked at what Law Fall's vision was, and they stated that this was a brilliant vision that represented American founding principles in a landscape form, in an architecture form. So they went to Versailles, they went to Paris, they went to Rome, they went to other cities to see what had inspired Law Fall. And again, they saw these Enlightenment principles applied to architecture and city planning, and they came up with their new plan. Now, what they did do is they expanded the mall greatly. They more than doubled its size. The Washington Monument used to be on the banks of the Potomac. But in the late 19th century, the Army Corps of Engineers dredged the Potomac, dumped that soil west and south of the Washington Monument. We ended up with hundreds of acres of man-made land. And the Macmillan Commission said, well, let's expand the mall. So they expanded the mall a mile west from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, a monument to that one president who could be spoken of in concert with George Washington. George Washington was the father of the country, and Abraham Lincoln was the preserver of the country. And then they expanded the mall down to what became the Jefferson Memorial and Tidal Basin. So Law Fall's vision was renewed, restored, and expanded, but always the concept of American democracy and the Constitution were at the root of it.
By the beginning of the 20th century, the National Mall had become something more than Pierre L'Enfant could have imagined. Not because his vision had been abandoned, but because it had continued. The Constitution's authors never imagined what 27 amendments might be, but they understood that a republic built on self-government would have to evolve. So they left room for amendment. L'Enfant did not imagine Abraham Lincoln. James Macmillan did not imagine Marian Anderson. Neither man could have known the people, the struggles, or the questions that future generations would bring. What they imagined was something more enduring, a republic that would continue to evolve, and a public realm with enough room to evolve alongside it. Great civic design does not predict the future. It makes room for it. By 1939, the stage was set. The Republic had survived its first century. The capital had been renewed. The civic heart of the nation had been reclaimed. Now, all it needed was a public.
And so we come to the intermission of this concert recital by Marian Anderson. Again, Miss Anderson goes to the concert stage to acknowledge the applause of this tremendous audience. During this intermission, it may be possible for us to bring you a word picture of this magnificent setting. The concert is being held here on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Just at the first setback of steps is built a small concert stage, just large enough to accommodate a large concert grand piano and our distinguished soloist, Miss Marian Anderson. Flanking the stage and in front are several rows of seats occupied by the sponsors of the concert and other distinguished guests. But a picture of this memorial. The memorial rises against a brilliant blue sky that is now just softening slightly by the approaching dusk. Seems a very light mist is coming up from the historic Potomac to the rear and around to our right here. The scene from the steps, here where we are standing, is perhaps the most breathtaking in all of the nation's capital. The steps go down from the memorial to the reflection pool, and we can see mirrored in its surface the entire height of the Washington Monument that stands at the other end of the pool about 1/2 mile from us. And far in the distance we see a portion of the majestic dome of the Capitol building. We see only a portion of it because it's on a perfect line with the Washington Monument, and the monument blots out all but that part of the dome. The wings of the Capitol building housing the Senate and the House of Representatives are quite distinguishable from our very high point of vantage here. The Capitol is separated from the memorial by the half mile to the Washington Monument, and then by the long sweep of the Mall, the central parkway that runs from the base of the Washington Monument to the Capitol building.
Sidewalk Ballet is a production of Big Creative Consulting. Start a big creative conversation at bigcreativeconsulting.com. This has been part one of a two-part documentary about the democracy of public space. Thank you to Professor Setha Low, to Judy Feldman, to Dr. Kara Courage, and to Professor Sheila Foster. There are links to find out more about their work in the show notes, and we will talk more with each of them in part two. Mastering by Ryan Musante. Our theme song and original music is by the Peacoat Project. Ave Maria was performed by Marian Anderson on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Thank you for joining me on this block of the Sidewalk Ballet. I'm Chip. I'll see you downtown.
At the age of 8, she was called the baby contralto and won her first fee, 50 cents, at that time. Up until the age of 16, her musical education was more or less catch as catch can, but later persons in the South Philadelphia high school that she was attending were impressed with the unusual range of her voice. People in the neighborhood put together nickels and dimes to contribute toward music lessons.